Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 18, Section 2, Life During the Great Depression. So follow along. Here we go. A while back, we talked a little bit about kind of the start of the Depression, and a lot of people attribute it to the fact that in America we had been overproducing a lot of goods. um, the Great Depression, some people believe, also began with the crash of the stock market in 1929. But really, by the time we get to 1932, which, by the way, was an election year, the hurt was on. We mentioned in section one that one out of four people were unemployed. And that meant that, 25% of our American population was without work. And that was rough. Some 30,000 companies in 1932 had gone out of business. That kind of led to some of this. One of the biggest employers in parts of the United States was U.S. Steel. If you remember back to Andrew Carnegie and such, uh, at a time when there were a lot of people that were needing jobs, they also shut the doors and put a lot of people out of work. So it was a really difficult time in our nation. And as a result, we had a lot of folks that lost their homes and were kind of wandering around this country. And so throughout the country, the newly homeless put up shacks on the unused or public lands, forming what would be known as shanty towns. And if you take a look at the pictures, particularly the one in the middle, we had a lot of folks that were living in shanty towns. And it wasn't just something that you would see back east or on the West Coast, but even in the middle of the nation, cities like Chicago, cities like Kansas City and St. Louis and Omaha all experienced a certain number of people that had lost their homes and basically had taken to building up shacks wherever they could. You had folks that were desperate for work. There was uh, a year there where there was a kind of an abundance of apples, and so people could go out and basically sell apples for a nickel each. But needless to say, people were looking for a scapegoat, and Herbert Hoover kind of fit the bill for taking the blame for all of this. As a matter of fact, aside from these kids in the previous picture that were blasting him or blaming him, uh, many people who were living in these shanty towns kind of referred to them as Hoovervilles. And not only that, people who were so dirt poor that they didn't have any money, they would pull the pockets out of their pants, uh, and that would be known as a Hoover flag to let everybody know that they were penniless. You also had folks that were homeless that would use newspapers and cardboards to snuggle up at night, and those became known as Hoover blankets. So Hoover was kind of a bad name to have during this period of time. The poor guy, even though he was a very good man, ended up taking a lot of blame for what was happening in our country. From basically the Dakotas all the way down to Texas, America's wheatland became known as the Dust Bowl. And you kind of have to know a little bit of the background story about this. It really goes back to the days of World War One. During the First World War, the price of wheat had actually gone up because there was such a demand in Europe, particularly to feed the people of Belgium and to feed those people who were our allies. And so during the war years, people had gone into areas that had never been plowed and broke up or sod busted the prairie, particularly in parts of like southwestern Kansas and the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma and parts of southeastern Colorado and northeastern New Mexico, areas that had been probably better known for grazing land for cattle, became wheat fields. And when the war ends, so does the demand for wheat. And what ends up happening is individuals who came out to raise crops that weren't from this region originally kind of went bust. They lost their land, or they couldn't pay it back, and so they just took off and they left the land basically untilled. And what ends up happening is some of that topsoil, as we get into the 1930s, starts blowing away, and that's kind of where these big menacing dust clouds kind of come from. Got to remember when we talk about some of the conservation practices that are in agriculture today, those things didn't really exist during the 1930s. And really, uh, what we have in place today as far as agriculture probably is a result of some of the things that had happened in the 1930s and times after. But nevertheless, you had some folks that were so hard hit that in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas that they packed up and they put everything they had in their old cars or trucks and they headed out to the West Coast. And the goal was to make it to California because there were rumors in the 1930s that if you made it to California, you had it made. There would be jobs to be had. You could go out and pick all the fruit that you could possibly pick. Um, what ends up happening is a lot of the folks that had come from Oklahoma and Arkansas, they get out there and they find themselves in shanty towns because there is no work to be had. Matter of fact, these new migrants become known as Okies. And not all of them were from Oklahoma, but it was kind of a derogatory term that was used to kind of slam these folks for being there. So, needless to say, it was a very rough time, but these menacing clouds certainly were not an unusual sight if you lived in the Midwest during the 1930s. The photos that you're seeing here, some of these are photos that were taken in Kansas and Oklahoma, but you could live in Nebraska and you would have seen this sight. If you look down in the bottom corner, it's kind of a farmstead photo. This is kind of the aftermath of the dust storm. And if you look at the dirt on the ground there, it looks like snowdrifts. It's fine. It kind of blew around like a drift of snow, but it's dirt. And unfortunately, uh, that kind of fine dirt got into everything. It got into homes, it got into your cars, and worse yet, it got into your lungs. And it was not unheard of people suffering from what they would call black pneumonia, which was basically that dust that would cake up your lungs and cause respiratory issues, as crazy as it may seem. Sometimes those clouds were also tied in with weather issues. So if there was a cold front or something coming in, it wouldn't be unheard of to hear that there would be maybe thunder or even lightning coming out of some of these, really menacing clouds. Visibility was very poor, and sometimes these clouds could stick around for days on end. Occasionally today, you might see stories about dust clouds kind of like this. I've seen news reports out of cities like Phoenix, where occasionally they'll have a kind of a storm front that will come through, and some of the sand and dirt that comes off of the desert will form some of these kind of clouds. But to see this kind of sight outside of places like Arizona was kind of unheard of until the 1930s when we were seeing it in the Midlands or the heartlands of our country. So, needless to say, that certainly would be a terrifying sight. I mentioned in class a while back that there could be electrical charges that are within those clouds of dust, and so if you would have put your hand on a barbed wire fence, it might have carried an electrical charge. Sometimes even telephone lines were highly charged. Anything that was metal, windmills, things like that. So that certainly could cause a lot of fear for folks during this period of time. This is a photo That actually comes out of, the Platte County, Historical Society, and supposedly it's a picture outside of Humphrey, Nebraska, which, maybe this will help us understand how close to home it really got. We were not spared by any of this by any means. Earlier this week, you had a current event talking a little bit about Dorothea Lange and some of her photographs. I wanted to talk a little bit about the migrant woman that you see here. This was a poster that I had up in the room, but since we're not in our room right now, you can take a look at this. Uh, the thing that I think is interesting is, as a kid, when I saw this photo, I didn't realize there was more to it than just the woman that was kind of the center of the photograph. You can see her children that are around her, and even the infant that she's holding in her hands. And if you look closely at that infant, how dirty that baby is. If you know anything about a young mom, the last thing they want is for their children to be dirty and not necessarily looking their best. You can see the deep wrinkles in her forehead and the worry that's kind of on her face. This is a woman that has had to bear some really tough times. Down below are some additional images that Lang took, but probably not as well known. Um, excuse me there, as the image that you see above. But it does kind of help you understand what was happening within this series of photographs. You also see an older daughter over here that you don't see in the little more intimate portrait that um, has kind of become iconic for the 1930s. So anyway, people had to find a way to, I guess, forget about their pains and struggles, and a lot of people turn to movies and radio just to get a break. And so during the 1930s, more than 60 million Americans went to the movies each week. One of the reasons why people went to the movies is, number one, it was a really reasonable form of entertainment. You could go to a movie on a Saturday morning for, maybe even a dime, and you could stay there for the most part of the day. I mean, there would be several movies that you could see on that dime. Some businesses even did giveaway kind of deals or raffles. So you could go to the movie and you might walk away with a prize before it was all said and done. So people would go and you could see cartoons and you could see newsreels to kind of find out what was happening around the world. You could also see westerns or dramas, comedies, and such. All these were a great break from kind of the seriousness of this era of time. Some folks like to listen to the radio, and they might listen to comedians like Jack Benny, who you see there in the colorized photo down there in the left hand corner, or George Burns and Gracie Allen, who you see in the middle. They kind of were, it was kind of the what I would call the serious or straight man in the comedy routine. And Gracie Allen was kind of the prototypical dumb blonde. But needless to say, they were people that uh, could take your mind off of the seriousness of the time period. Radio melodramas were sometimes sponsored by laundry soap companies, and they became known as soap operas. Not uncommon that uh, not only would you have soap operas maybe for adults, but you might hear about the Lone Ranger, who was more of a Western icon, or you might hear a little bit about other comedians doing their routines and such, but um, people needed that as a break. And certainly they kind of gravitated to this form of entertainment, and probably because it was very affordable. During the Depression, artists and also writers portrayed the life around them. I mentioned before you had your current event over Dorothea Lange. Um, Certainly she would be a well-known artist and photographer, but there were others like John Steinbeck, who wrote a little bit about social um, indignations or social injustices that were happening. You might have read of Mice and Men, but probably the iconic Great Depression piece was a novel that he wrote called The Grapes of Wrath, and portraying the story of some Okies who headed west and all the hardships that they faced when they got to California. All of this certainly kind of helps us understand the reality of this period of time. In 1936, magazine publisher Henry Luntz introduced Life magazine, which for the most part was a photojournalist magazine. It was a magazine of photographs, and people loved it. They would literally wait every week so that they could get their copy of this so that they could be able to flip through it and see what was going on in the world that they lived in. It was good entertainment. All right. Thank you so much.